Okay, I hope you're seeing the coat of arms of the King of Denmark. Uh, okay, um, I'm showing this because the coat of arms of the King of Denmark, uh, the symbol for Greenland, of all the possessions of the Danish, uh, is this polar bear. That is their symbol for Greenland. But they just redid their coat of arms, and now the polar bear is 3 or 4 times larger than previously. So I don't know if that means that the price for Greenland has tripled. If that reflects that, not sure. But I thought that was amusing. Um, so, Jimmy Carter, off we go. Um, he started, of course, the presidential library. Aiko and I visited this in 2015. So
Can you bring more coffee?
this is kind of personal. Yeah, Bob.
Just back to the Danish coat of arms for a second. My Danish stepfather was on the phone this morning. He is absolutely, he was in a rage over the upcoming president number 47, is it? They're all in a rage in Denmark. And I think the change in the coat of arms exemplifies that. The thing is that the Greenland is wanting its full independence from Denmark anyway. And the New Year's Day speech of the Prime Minister of Greenland was pretty spot on, saying they got to pursue independence. In the meantime, the New Year's Day speech of the King of Denmark managed to mention Greenland twice, whilst being completely anodyne and politically correct in every other aspect. But oddly enough, the Prime Minister of Denmark also has a New Year's Day speech. That's Mette Frederiksen, who's the leader of the sort of center-left party. And she spent, it was as though she'd never heard of Roosevelt suggesting that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It was the most fear-mongering New Year's Day speech imaginable, but it wasn't directed towards Trump. It was in fear of Putin. So they're getting it from both sides. And I thought I'll just leave it at that.
Well, we know that she's been a real hawk, and she piloted getting the F-16s to Ukraine. She gave them, she let the Ukrainian pilots come to Denmark and train in them before they actually had them. So there you go. For you
Yeah, in
late
terms of
first,
percentage of GDP, Denmark has got the highest contribution to defense of any other country in the EU. Yeah, they are petrified because they're on the Baltic. They're petrified.
yeah, yeah. For those of you latecomers, just to show that the King of Denmark changed the coat of arms, tripling the size of the symbol, the polar bear for Greenland. Okay, Jim.
I just got a communication from a guy who's a consulate, I guess, for Estonia, who visited Estonia recently. He says they're very worried. Um, but he's depending on NATO, and he pointed out that in Afghanistan, the per capita deaths in Afghanistan were more for Estonia than they were for the US
Wow.
in
Okay.
their contribution to NATO.
Okay. All right. All right. So I don't plan in the future on spending as much time on American foreign policy, but that was irresistible. So this is very personal. Aiko and I went there in 2015 to the library. It was dedicated in 1986, and on a grace note, Reagan came, and you can see Jimmy appreciated his presentation. It's a different era of politics. Um, so I like this. His biographer, Jonathan Alter, um, said, sure, he was a political failure, but if you look at the substance, he was more successful. And that's what I want to do today is look at the substance. Alter points out that he prevented at least 5 wars, 3 when he was president, and then 2 later when he left office. And you scratch your head about North Korea, but in 1984, he got Kim Il-sung, the father of the current dictator, to back off developing nuclear weapons. But Kim Il-sung died shortly thereafter. And the other thing, I'm going to emphasize this a lot later on, the Camp David Accords were a big deal. Egypt has the only army that has defeated Israel army in the Yom Kippur War, and they have this peace treaty that Jimmy Carter affected, as you'll see when we get to it. And Alter calls it the most successful treaty since the end of World War II. High praise. And then Alter poetically points out that Carter lived in 3 centuries. He was born into the rural South that was still living in the 19th century, and you'll see why in just a minute. And he advanced the 4 great movements of the 20th century: civil rights, women's rights, human rights abroad, and the environment. Plus, he hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union, something Reagan routinely gets credit for. And then in the 21st century, as an old man, he rose to the challenge and led the way in conflict resolution, disease eradication, democracy promotion, and sustainable development. And I'm going to dive into all of those. That's just the summary. Here's a presidential ranking. It's one of these kind of subjective because it's a popularity contest among scholars and think tanks. But given that it's a popularity contest, Jimmy Carter ranks 26th, which is interesting. Reagan is 11th. Clinton is 8th. Truman is 6th, and Eisenhower in the middle at number 7. And then you go up beyond Reagan, you get LBJ, you get JFK, you get at 17 Papa Bush, you get number 18 Barack Obama. So these are all fairly recent. You wonder if there's what's called a recency bias that. Even Gerald Ford made the list above Jimmy Carter. And then going down, you get Richard Nixon at 34, Bush the younger at 35, which I think is too high. But where's Trump? So C-SPAN, that poll that we just looked at was done while Trump was president the first time. But C-SPAN, 41 out of 44. Siena College, 43 out of 45. The American Political Science Association, the worst, but they're probably a little bit biased, academic bias to the left. But even the self-identified Republican historians place him among the bottom 5 presidents. So yeah, it's probably too early. History, it doesn't really come into being for at least 10, maybe 20 years. So it's a little early for Trump. The View from Britain, The Economist, their obituary calls him the most virtuous of all American presidents. And we get our trip to the Carter Presidential Library. This slides from there. So some of these, they're not high quality. But what really impressed me was Carter's early life. He was living in an integrated society. He was living with the sharecroppers on his father's 300 acres. And they lived not in plains, but just down the road in the actual agricultural buildings in Archery, Georgia. And to make the case that he lived in the 19th century standard of life, until he was age 11, there was no running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment, no toilets, only outhouses, hand-cranked wells, kerosene lamps, and mule-driven plows. I don't know if any of you have had the experience, but when I was young, we every summer we went to relatives that lived on such a farm in Kentucky. And when I was there, I had the chore of pumping the water. We used the outhouse, and it became second nature. So maybe Michael has something similar to report. Michael.
Well, you might also add they had at that time no telephone either. Things that were subsequently brought in by federal programs, just to add to the list.
Yeah, yeah. And the rural electrification program, if you want to read an interesting chapter on that, read, I think it's the second in the 4-part series by Robert Caro on LBJ. The chapter on rural electrification and how LBJ got that to the hill country of Texas is fascinating reading if you want to see how politics really works and how LBJ worked the system. There was no way using the mathematical formulae that the hill country should have qualified for early rural electrification, but LBJ got it. So race, right at the beginning of the Carter Library, you see the 3 busts, and I think the theme here is race. Jimmy certainly felt it. And some would say Clinton is an honorable mention, and some have even called him the first African-American president, with exaggeration. And as evidence of that, he was a confidant with Andrew Young, He made Young the UN ambassador. He had been a civil rights activist close to Martin Luther King. And I found it interesting going through that Carter was joined in with the arms embargo against South Africa, but the economic sanctions was a bridge too far for him and Andrew Young. So there was some restraint there, and that's a recurring theme, restraint. Andrew Young, though, told a French newspaper that he thought Americans still had political prisoners, referencing jailed civil rights activists and anti-war protesters. A representative from Georgia offered a resolution to impeach Young, but that failed. And Carter backed away from that, saying it was an unfortunate statement. But the Andy Young affair was too far. He met with a representative of the PLO, and the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, leaked that. And Carter had to ask Young to resign. And Young later took a shot at Israel, saying they were stubborn and intransigent. So that was that. Now I want to go back to archery and planes. I just wanted to take that diversion on race because I thought it was important to cover it in total. His mother, Miss Lillian, we remember Miss Lillian, and she was quite a character, again, from the Carter Center. She was a progressive public health nurse, and once she got her training, she came back and provided care to the blacks in archery and everybody in planes. And at the age of 68, she joined the Peace Corps and went to India. So there was a real calling to public service. Jimmy went to Annapolis. He was made his way and stayed in as a commissioned nuclear submarine commander. But when his father died, he upped sticks. He went back to the farm. And Rosalind was not happy about that. She didn't necessarily want to go back. But Jimmy did, and they turned the farm into a modern peanut farm, along with starting a seed supply store, and made it into a kind of a progressive grange operation. So time went by. He got involved in local politics, and he went for the Senate, and he failed on his first try. But he was undaunted. He finally made it in 1962. So remember, 14 years from later, he's going to be president of the United States. But as a senator in Georgia, he specialized in education and micromanaged it, which he also did in the White House. And that was one of the critiques of him, that he did get too far down into the weeds. He ran unsuccessfully for the governor. And he responded by studying theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote on how difficult it is to do politics in a sinful world. Just a reminder, Reinhold Niebuhr was a pacifist in World War I, but when World War II came, he said, nope, you got to take a stand and stand up to violence. He was also studied by Barack Obama. And then in Laos, he became born again. And he turned to his younger sister, who was an evangelist, and he, as an act of humility, went with her knocking on doors as part of the Baptist mission outreach in Pennsylvania. Imagine someone's at your front door, wants you to start thinking about religion, and in 14 years they're going to be president of the United States. So this is him with his younger sister. She was a victim of depression, and I almost wonder if that was a recurring family problem. But she turned to religion to pull her out of her depression. I don't know if you remember, but while Jimmy was president, she briefly converted Larry Flint, who was a pornographer, to convert, however briefly, to Christianity. And her best friend, living in Plains, was Rosalind Carter, who was 3 years younger than Jimmy. So I want to say a few words about their family tree and the diseases in their family tree. 4 people on this family tree had pancreatic cancer. Jimmy's father and all 3 of his siblings all had pancreatic cancer. His mother died of breast cancer, so strong family history. And when Jimmy was 90, he had a mass on his liver that had been discovered incidentally. And of course, everybody was very much aware of the pancreatic cancer, but it wasn't. It was malignant melanoma from all the years working in the sun. With his fair skin. And you all remember he had metastasis to his brain, but he had one of these lucky matches to a biologic that messenger RNA, which we experienced in the vaccines for COVID, that could leverage his own body's immune system. And all the metastases in his brain, 4 of them, disappeared. It's just amazing how lucky he was. He also had the surgery and radiation, but that doesn't cure people of metastatic melanoma. It was the new family of biologics that did that. So who defeated him in 1966? A name maybe you remember. He was defeated by segregationist Lester Maddox, who was famous for standing at his door of his restaurant and holding a pickaxe handle to keep his restaurant from being integrated. So that's what Jimmy was up against. Jimmy repeated in 1960, and this time he won. He didn't have to run against Maddox because in Georgia, you can only run for 1 term at a time. Maddox, who was still popular, ran for lieutenant governor with Jimmy. They weren't on a joint ticket by any means. So Jimmy's governor and Lester Maddox is his lieutenant. Jimmy, though, revealed his true feelings on race. During his inauguration, he said the time for racial discrimination is over, which was a shocking thing to say in Georgia. And he had downplayed that during the election, so the segregationists felt betrayed. Needless to say, he and Maddox feuded in public for the next 4 years. He angered the KKK by appointing black judges and state employees. He hung portraits of African Americans in the Georgia Capitol building, but he was anti-busing. So again, evidence of some restraint. The perhaps foreshadowing his future in Washington, he feuded with the legislature. He was not a good old boy, a politician that would engage with the legislature. And so there was a cost for him not playing the pork barrel game. But he did cut graft and routine corruption in Georgia, which he had witnessed up close in Plains. Pork barrel, just an aside, refers, it was a neutral term, localized projects for a representative's district. It was meant as a homely metaphor, but it quickly became pejorative. A pork barrel was where a brine solution where meat was preserved at the country store. He ran for president. He could not run for governor again in Georgia. And even if he had, he may not have been elected. But in post-Watergate, it was a breath of fresh air. I will never lie to you. Brother Billy, very colorful. He pointed out, I got a mother joined the Peace Corps and went to India at 68. I got a sister who races motorcycles. I got a sister who's a holy roller preacher. I've got a brother who says he wants to be president of the United States. I'm the only sane one in the family. So he, as a breath of fresh air, he was way ahead in the post-Watergate atmosphere until he shot himself in the foot with a Playboy interview that he had sinned in his heart. Evangelicals were turned off by that remark, just the fact that he had submitted to an interview by Playboy. But he won narrowly, but he won. And as we all remember, he walked Pennsylvania Avenue. Security be damned. So what were his accomplishments as president? I say he was underrated. He appointed more women and black and Jews to official positions and judgeships than all his predecessors combined. He bought into human rights abroad. We talked when we did international law about the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights established by the United Nations. He bought into that and talked about it frequently. He pardoned all those who had evaded the draft for Vietnam. And he put in independent inspectors into every department and established that corporations could not bribe foreign officials to get contracts. So he covered the foreign behavior of our corporations. Eichel? I heard my wife. The next list is the five E's: education, energy, including green energy, environment. The greatest conservation president since Theodore Roosevelt, mostly for what he did in Alaska, ethics, and the FEMA emergency. He doubled the national park system, instituted major civil service reform. He aspired to a balanced budget, and it was mainly he didn't achieve that, but he turned away from costly liberal programs like Teddy Kennedy's health insurance initiative. And he did deregulation. Reagan often gets credit, but he did it. Airlines and trucking, railroads, phone service, and even beer, which unlocked all the hobby beer enthusiasts that we have today. He created twice as many jobs as Reagan did. And he also did a lot to bring down the Soviet Union. I'll talk about that in a second. His major foreign achievement, though, was the Camp David Accords that I alluded to earlier, which brought some security to Israel. They had to abandon the Sinai, but they got a major peace deal, which is held with Egypt. And Carter thought that it was the religious faith of all three of them that made an agreement possible. At one point, Begin threatened to leave, and Jimmy Carter sat down and wrote a letter to the future to Begin's grandchildren. And it's a ploy that worked. And whenever he was dealing with other prickly politicians, he would invite them to sit in a rocking chair on the Truman balcony and talk about their grandchildren, because that's what the aspiration of a foreign policy should be. He also built on what Nixon had done in China, and he invited Nixon to the White House to meet Deng Xiaoping, and he returned the Panama Canal to avoid what was threatening to be a guerrilla war if we hadn't left it. And to do that, he had to convince 16 Republicans to join the Democrats to get the necessary 2/3, which is required for foreign treaties. He had a balanced view with Russia. They did the SALT II test ban, and they look at limiting ballistic missiles. But there was still the Soviet nuclear threat to Europe, and he was very aware of that. And when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, he went into high mode. He cut off the grain sales to the USSR, and he did a massive defense buildup, started it before Reagan, which included a stealth bomber, and he persuaded European leaders to accept nuclear Pershing missiles to offset the Russians' natural geographic advantage. But he established a second track. So the policy was called a dual track policy. But if you look at the map of what Russia was looking at with these new missiles coming in, you can see that, well, this is the current map, NATO members, including Finland and Sweden. But the nuclear installations, you have nuclear hosts in Germany and in Turkey, and you can see from the standpoint of Russia that they were getting nervous, but the dual track came to fruition when Reagan was in power. The intermediate range nuclear forces, INF, was signed in 1987 that limited both Russia and America's mid-range nuclear missiles, which gave the world some security until things started to go south. I don't want to spend too much time on this because the topic is Jimmy Carter, but when Bush, the younger, withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that was over Russia's objection. They didn't like that, but what could they do in 2002? We kind of had a unilateral power, but when we withdrew from that limitation, Russia didn't have much in the way of ballistic missiles, but Putin remembered that. And in 2007, he made a speech where he scolded the West in Munich. This is an annual conference that had been going on for years. And he said that he was really worried that the INF treaty didn't cover China. In fact, the United States was more worried about China in the Pacific than Putin was. But Putin raised the question to open the door, and then they violated the treaty in 2008, and there were other breaches. I'm not going to go through this, take too much time. But one thing led to another. And in 2019, Trump gave Russia a 6-month timeline to do what we wanted them to do, and they didn't. And so we pulled out of that INF treaty that Reagan and Russia had signed. And that opened the door for hypersonic missiles, which we've seen Putin has used in Ukraine. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, blamed Russia solely, but other Americans who had some experience in arms control thought it was a mistake and thought that urged Trump to back off. Gorbachev thought it was not the work of a great mind to withdraw from that treaty. But Congress had pointed out to the Trump administration that they had given Putin an easy way out of a treaty. And that was echoed by other Europeans. A quick survey. But this is the world we live in, which is much more fraught than it was when Jimmy Carter started the two-track policy and Reagan signed on for it. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 79, and Carter boycotted the Olympics in Russia the following year. Carter visited a lot of countries when he was president. The first to go to sub-Saharan Africa. Of all the visits that he made, this one here is the most fraught. This is Iran, which he visited in 1977. And it was on New Year's Eve. He and the Shah toasted each other with all of Iranians watching, celebrating the new year. What's their king doing? And he's entertaining Jimmy Carter. And so Jimmy reciprocated, and the Shah came back the next to America the next month. And then in 79, the Iranian Revolution ousted the Shah, and Shah by then had cancer, and Carter humanely allowed him to come to America, enraging the radicals who took over our embassy and took 54 hostages, which they held for 444 days until Ronald Reagan was the day of his inauguration. So it was a humiliation. It was a geopolitical setback. But domestically, it decreased the international market for oil with Iran shutting down. And Jimmy had inherited inflation, but that only got worse. And why were the Iranians reacting so furiously? It's an old grudge. This is Mohammad Mossadegh. He was an enlightened Iranian politician. He was the Man of the Year in 1952, Time magazine. He was a reformer. He'd done all the right things, and Truman had blessed him. He met with Truman. Truman concluded that the British, who were there with British Petroleum and had been for 60 years, that their policy was destructive and determined on a rule or ruin policy. At the time, Mossadegh was serving in a constitutional monarchy. The Shah was a king, but it was a constitutional monarchy. And then Ike was elected and turned things over to the Dulles brothers. So when Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil, the United States joined Britain in engineering a coup led by the army to overthrow Mossadegh and turn the clock back on reform. And the Shah, who had fled the country, came back, and now it was no longer a constitutional monarchy. He was an autocrat. The coup was led by Kermit Roosevelt, who was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, the third from the right here. And he joined the forerunner of the CIA, the OSS. And for those of you who read Julia Child's autobiography, you know that she was also in the OSS during World War II. And so, Civil War, basically, people went to the streets in favor of Mossadegh, but the conservatives countered that. And of course, they had the army on their side. So the army decided that Mossadegh had to be put on trial. He was imprisoned for 3 years. He was sarcastic when he got his sentence. I want to thank you. You're teaching the Iranian people the true meaning of constitutionalism and how valuable it is because you're taking it away. And he was put under house arrest until his death. He lived to be 84, and he had requested a public burial and to be buried in the graveyard beside other victims of political violence. But that was denied him. The government knew that would cause a furor, and he had to be buried underneath his living room to prevent that. Kermit, just a little P.S. Some of us maybe read The River of Doubt about a exploratory trip in the Amazon basin that was taken by Kermit Roosevelt and his father. And it's quite a book that describes disease, near drowning, murder. And this is Kermit in that adventure. So the bad timing of the Iranian revolution, the lack of oil added to inflation, and stagflation just really went through the roof. Jimmy Carter did not know Paul Volcker, but he knew that he might be able to solve a problem that he couldn't, which was stagflation. So he appointed him. Paul Volcker cranked up the interest rates quite high and just squeezed out inflation. It was terrible in Reagan's early years, and Reagan's popularity plummeted. But it barely worked in time for the 1984 election, and of course Reagan was reelected, and so and I just wanted to point out how unlucky Jimmy Carter was. The incidence of inflation peaked. There was a double tack when Nixon and Ford were in office. They had whip inflation now, the win, but then it eased off, but came roaring back with the Iranian revolution. And so Carter was really unlucky to be whipped by that double wave. So in 1980, of course, he's defeated. He said that no citizen had been killed in war, nor any soldier during his administration. There was one exception I'll get to, and that was sufficient consolation. And so Jimmy Carter retires to Plains. His faith helps him. He is still an evangelical, but it's a progressive kind of evangelicalism. One person said he's the only person in history for whom the presidency was merely a stepping stone. because he had other things in mind. This was in the Carter Library, and I thought it was maybe a little hint that Jimmy might have been depressed for a while, because his sister had been. And Rosalind Carter, his first lady, her project was mental health awareness. He described his own state of mind as being somewhat aimless and uncertain. And he was going to have many other crises in his family and of course, his melanoma. But he was a religious in a religious country, but the presidents wore their religion lightly in what the economists call muted colors of Episcopalianism and Presbyterianism, where God could be turned on or off, but not for Jimmy. God was permanently present, especially after he was born again. He wound up feuding with the Southern Baptist Convention over the equality of women. So he quit. He quit. And I like this quote, the closest to a Renaissance man since Thomas Jefferson. He did all these things, and we've read about it, and we've all been inspired by his 40 years as a post-president. Especially, he was hands-on once a year, Habit for Humanity, and made it the largest not-for-profit home builder in the world. And he and Rosalind would go out, and Jimmy was a woodworker. He had that skill from growing up on a farm, and his studies. But from a medical point of view, when we were at the Carter Center, this really caught my eye. The disease that he decided to tackle was the guinea worm. And here, a guinea worm, which can be up to a meter long, is being eradicated from the foot of a young girl. And when he took on the guinea worm, there were 3.5 million people a year were being infected. In 2022, there were only 13. So what did he do? This is the life cycle of the guinea worm, and it's mainly contaminated water, releases larvae. The larvae form worms in the lymphatics and come out of leak out of the foot, which recontaminates water. But there's an intermediate host. There's a water flea that has to carry immature larvae into more mature larvae, which gives an opportunity for attacking it in a community. This is from the Carter Center, how they protected the water, how they got rid of the fleas. So if you can get rid of the intermediate host, that'll do a great deal. Larvicide, filters. And when Jimmy was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma in 2015, he just said, I want to live longer than the last guinea worm. That's all. And in a way, he did. For that, he won praise from another reformer, Bill and Melinda Gates. And the great prize, of course, is the Nobel he got in 2002. The only time a president has gotten a Nobel for what he did after being a president. And it was for decades of untiring effort, advancing democracy and human rights. And the very thing that kind of got in his way in the White House was the micromanagement and stuff. But to get some of his post-president stuff off the ground, micromanagement and persistence. He had the time. He had the focus, and so his reputation was redefined and therefore redeemed. Some people call him America's conscience and its moral ambassador. He also supervised the election in 100 countries. He oversaw agriculture reform in the developing world, tripling grain production in some places. He was asked that the Nobel Prize, that must be the most exciting thing that ever happened to you. And he said, no, this when Rosalind said she'd marry me. That was the most exciting thing. Miscellaneous. This caught my eye at the Carter Library. He and Rosalind visited Cuba on their own without approval, and certainly not part of American foreign policy. And he played baseball with Fidel, was asked to throw out the first pitch, which he said was a changeup. He insisted that he not have any extra security. I'm not sure the current administration would have given it to him, but he went without security. And it just reminded me of something from the Japanese occupation by MacArthur. He similarly insisted that he not have security to a huge extent. He rode around in open cars with very light security because he wanted the Japanese people to trust him and to cooperate with him. Just a connection that I couldn't resist making. He disagreed with the successors on many things, but most vociferously over Iraq. He did not think it was an imminent threat. He thought there was misleading information. He was right on both counts. And he was worried about doing it without broad international support that would undermine U.S. credibility, and it has, and is often mentioned. And he thought it would divert resources from Afghanistan, which it did. And he thought it would unleash chaos, which it did, and perversely strengthened Iranian control and their sphere of influence in Iraq. International leaders disagreed with it as well. France, Germany, and Russia, Putin. It's kind of rich to see that he saw it a violation of international law, this indicted war criminal. But he saw it as destabilizing, and it was. He was most strong on Israel and Palestine. And he earned the right to be, I'd submit, just by virtue of the success of the David Accords. But he used the A word, and it has been used increasingly as the years roll by. In his farewell address in 1981, he was worried about the focus on individualism, and we've heard that as a recurrent theme when Ramsey talks about American character. And that we were becoming, our politics was becoming single issue groups without an overarching feeling for the common good. It's basically our own private interests. And he said human rights had, after all, been invented in America, the Pilgrims seeking a religious freedom, and a great source for cohesion at home. So David French enlarges on this theme that he enunciated in his farewell address to the country. He goes back a couple of years and looks at the so-called malaise speech of 1979. And who's David French? He's a columnist for the New York Times, a Harvard-educated lawyer, a veteran, and a fellow evangelical, interestingly. And he looks at that speech now, and he talks about the wounded heart of the country, a crisis of the spirit, and he thinks it was just 4 decades too soon, 40 years too soon, that speech, as he rereads it now, is more for our time. The pessimism then as now, most recently, 58% of Americans think our best years are behind us. Obviously, the disrespect for government institutions, except the military, is widespread. We just celebrated or commiserated over January 6th yesterday. So ask the American people to think about their own role in materialism. And when he was done, it resonated with the population. His popularity went up 11 points. And now it seems it's more relevant than ever. But French points out the problem was that the speech was followed by chaos. First, Carter, own making, he fired the entire cabinet. But then came the Iran hostage crisis, and then the botched rescue of the hostages. 8 soldiers died when a helicopter collided in the desert with one of the planes. And it was the debacle in the desert at the end of his term. But think about the counterfactual. What if that had succeeded? What if he had rescued those hostages and there would have been a ticker tape parade? And he points out what just is becoming clearer and clearer to me is that luck plays as big a role in a reputation as anything else. Of course, it would be nice if we could all commit to each other in that spirit and stop tearing each other apart. So we'll see what happens. The music, just to end on a lighter note, if you haven't watched this, I'd recommend it. It's a movie, Jimmy Carter, the rock and roll president. You get all these artists featured, in particular the Allman Brothers, who are from Georgia. But Johnny Cash is married to a cousin, Roseanne, or June Carter. And so he's related to Johnny Cash, a cousin by marriage. He also plays the harmonica here with Willie Nelson. He in 2021, shortly before Rosalind herself went into hospice, he had become the longest-lived president when he turned 94, so add another 6 years. Both of them went into hospice. And he said, I didn't ask God to let me live, but I asked God to give me a proper attitude towards death. And when he got that, he was completely at ease with death. So he defied expectations in hospice. He's been in hospice for a long time. The average is 17 days. But he rallied to attend the funeral of Rosalind when she died after 77 years of marriage. So the family thinks he lived on so Rosalind would never be left alone. He passed away a year and a month after Rosalind did. So that's it. I will stop here and let you all talk.
Well, I'm going to say I think Jimmy Carter suffered more than bad luck in his loss of his bid for re-election. I really think it's pretty well established that Reagan connived with the Iranians to block any release of the hostages before the election. That was what he called the October surprise that he worked quite improperly to prevent. Had those hostages been released, Carter might well have been reelected. Reagan did not want that to happen. So he negotiated independently with the hostage holders in Iran that they not be released until he was elected and was sworn into office, which is what happened.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Nixon in Vietnam, right?
Yep.
Okay, Michael.
Well, my comment is this may have been the last decent person, well, perhaps Biden, but I said, compared to what's coming in on January 20th, I said, here was a decent man. I mean, he had his shortcomings and bad luck, but I said, to the very end, he was a decent person, and I cannot say more than that. That to me is the highest praise you can give a person.
Okay.
Thank you for that, John.
All right, folks. My all right. So
Thank
next
you
week.
very much. Great summary.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
See you next week.
Okay, bye.